The early 1970s, the Cold War is in full swing. The United States and the Soviet Union continue their dangerous arms race, spying on each other from the depths of the oceans, from space, and increasing the number of nuclear warheads every year. Both powers have long realized that the future of war is not only tanks and planes, but also submarines carrying nuclear weapons capable of destroying a continent in minutes. It is during this period that an event occurs in the Pacific Ocean at a depth of more than 5 kilometers, which was supposed to remain classified forever. The Soviet submarine K-129 disappears from radar. The crew does not contact. Moscow loses one of its strategic nuclear submarines. The Soviet fleet begins an urgent search operation, but after a few weeks it is curtailed. The submarine cannot be found. For the USSR, this is a tragedy. For the United States, this is an opportunity that the CIA failed to take advantage of. The K-129 submarine belonged to Project 6-9A diesel-electric submarines with the ability to launch ballistic missiles. It was armed with 3 A-21 missiles with nuclear warheads capable of hitting targets at a distance of up to 1,200 kilometers. The submarine set out on an autonomous voyage from its base in Kamchatka in March 1968, but soon disappeared in an area that the Soviet Union considered its secret patrol route. Whether this was an accident or a mistake is still a matter of debate. However, the fact remains, the submarine sank in one of the deepest parts of the Pacific Ocean, in an area thousands of kilometers from any shore. What exactly happened on board? An explosion, a collision, a fire, or a technical malfunction has not been determined with certainty. The Soviet military conducted a limited investigation and declared the crew dead and the submarine lost. Meanwhile, the Americans began their own game. A reconnaissance satellite recorded anomalies in the ocean consistent with an underwater explosion. And soon the U.S. nuclear submarine Halibut, especially refitted for spy missions, was sent to the area of the supposed disaster. Its task, to establish the exact location of the K-129, take photographs of the bottom, and determine whether it is possible to raise the wreckage. After several weeks of careful work, the Americans received confirmation the submarine really lies at a depth of about 5,000 meters, and its hull is quite well preserved. For the CIA, this was a gift from fate. For the first time in the entire Cold War, American intelligence received a real opportunity to study a Soviet nuclear submarine in detail. Codes, documentation, instruments, launch systems, and even nuclear warheads could remain on board. The only question was how to get them out. What the CIA had to do sounded crazy. Build a special vessel, disguised as a civilian one, equip it with a giant underwater grabber, get to the wreck and pull the submarine out of the water from a depth of 5 kilometers. All this in complete secrecy, without attracting the attention of Soviet intelligence, the world press, and even its own Congress. Thus begins one of the most expensive and ambitious operations in the history of intelligence, Azorian, also known under the unofficial name Jennifer. The CIA understands that such an operation requires a unique cover. It was decided to use the name of the American billionaire Howard Hughes, known for his eccentricity, love of secret projects, and gigantic industrial ambitions. It is in his name that the construction of the vessel Glomar Explorer begins in 1970, supposedly for the extraction of minerals from the ocean floor. In fact, this vessel becomes the most high-tech spy platform of its time. It is equipped with a huge hatch that allows heavy structures to be lowered and raised, stabilization systems, highly accurate navigation instruments, and a unique grabbing device, a metal claw weighing hundreds of tons, capable of grasping the hull of a submarine. The project cost the equivalent of over $4 billion in today's dollars. All contracts were executed through front companies, documents were classified top secret, and the engineers and sailors involved in the project did not know the full picture. The CIA and the US Navy led the development at all stages. The operation was planned for several years, with every detail checked dozens of times. It was necessary not only to get the submarine, but to do it in such a way that no one would suspect. When the Glomar Explorer leaves the California harbor in June 1974, no one around guesses the ship's real purpose. Officially, it is an experimental drilling platform. In reality, this is the beginning of a unique underwater theft, the likes of which have never been seen before or since. The ship heads to the Pacific Ocean, to a point codenamed Jennifer Sector. On board are dozens of engineers, spies, technicians, and security guards. From this point on, the main part of the operation begins. Few people understand the technical difficulties that the project participants face. At a depth of 5 kilometers, the pressure reaches almost 500 atmospheres. The slightest mistake, and the capture mechanism will break, the cables will break, and the operation will fail. Everything must go perfectly. A unique lifting module, lowered to the bottom, connects to the capture system. It begins to slowly dive, descending to the bottom for more than 3 hours. The entire operation is coordinated in real time. Information comes from dozens of sensors. When the claw reaches the submarine, the capture process begins. Metal fingers close around the hull of the K-1-9. Everything seems to be going according to plan. However, no one suspects that the fate of the mission in the coming hours will change forever. The ascent has begun. The gripping system has firmly grasped the hull of the K-1-9 submarine, and the massive lifting module has slowly begun its upward movement. The specialists on board the Glomar Explorer monitored the indicators as if they were watching a heartbeat. Millimeter by millimeter, the submarine was rising from the bottomless ocean floor. The process took several days. During this time, the vessel practically froze in the Pacific Ocean. No unnecessary movements. All attention was focused on the mechanisms. A unique stabilization system did not allow the vessel to rock on the waves. Any deviation, and the grip could weaken. The submarine could break free. The structure could collapse. The crew worked in complete isolation. Radio silence, a closed perimeter, a regime of absolute secrecy. In decades of CIA operations, this mission was one of the most fragile and intense. Halfway through the ascent, the irreparable happened. The voltage in the hull of the submarine, seized by the claw, went off. The metal, which had lain on the seabed for 6 years under enormous pressure, began to crumble. The lower part of the structure, holding the K-1-9 hull segment, cracked. In a matter of seconds, almost 2/3 of the submarine, along with warheads, documents, and the bodies of the crew, broke free from the grip and sank into the abyss again. A stupor set in on board the Glomar Explorer. The mission that had been prepared for so many years was on the verge of failure. However, the upper part of the submarine remained in the grip. The ascent continued, although the atmosphere on the ship became oppressive. No one knew what exactly had been saved, or if there was anything valuable in this part. Finally, the object was delivered inside a special compartment of the ship. The design of the Glomar Explorer allowed the raised object to enter through a giant hatch without rising to the surface to avoid detection. When the steel jaw opened, a badly damaged section of the submarine's hull appeared before the engineers. Inside was part of a compartment, elements of cable wiring, metal parts. However, what really shocked the crew were the remains of the crew members. In conditions of complete hermeticity, under pressure and temperature, the bodies were preserved in an amazing condition. It was decided to bury them with military honors at sea. This episode became the only moment of the entire operation that was later officially recognized by the US government. In 1992, after the end of the Cold War, a video recording of the burial was transferred to Russia as a sign of respect for the dead. However, there was no talk of any transfer of data or equipment. Meanwhile, a thorough analysis of everything that was raised began at the CIA headquarters. Engineers, cryptographers, and military equipment specialists began studying the fragments. The main goal was to find out whether the delivered part of the submarine contained encryption machines, documents, or electronic components that could give American intelligence access to the Soviet Navy's communications system. According to some sources, this is exactly what happened. The lifted section allegedly contained a communications module with components of a cryptosystem that the USSR used in the late 1960s. If this information is reliable, then Operation Azorian was one of the CIA's greatest successes of the entire Cold War. Even partial decryption of Soviet communication channels would have given the US an advantage for a decade. However, the entire operation, despite its grandeur, could have been exposed literally overnight. Soviet intelligence was not asleep. At the time, when the Glomar Explorer was in the lifting area, Soviet ships appeared nearby several times. The CIA had to simulate drilling the seabed, drop technical containers, and once even conduct a fake demonstration of supposedly research equipment. Whether they managed to hide the true goal is a moot point. The Soviet Union did not officially acknowledge the fact of raising the submarine, but later, in the post-Soviet era, some military analysts pointed out that there were suspicions, but there was no certainty as to how far the Americans had gone. The CIA's main weapon in this story was not technology, but silence. Despite its partial success, Operation Azorian caused serious debate within the US government itself. The cost of the mission, the risks, and most importantly, its absolute secrecy without the knowledge of Congress and under the cover of civilian structures, jeopardized the reputation of the intelligence community. Some officials demanded reports, but the CIA insisted that the publication of any information would lead to a diplomatic crisis, and indeed, the world was then on the threshold of a new round of nuclear tension, and the publication of data on the actual theft of Soviet military equipment from the depths of the ocean could lead to unpredictable consequences. The story could have ended there, but in 1975, what the CIA feared most happened. Journalists learned about the operation. Reporter Jack Anderson began publishing materials indicating the existence of a secret vessel, its construction at the expense of the intelligence budget, and the possibility of raising a Soviet submarine. The CIA was shocked. The leak threatened not only their reputation, but also the entire concept of secret operations at sea. In response to the publications, an emergency decision was made to launch an information campaign, which later received the provisional name Glomar Doctrine. It was then that the famous phrase appeared, which became synonymous with a refusal to comment. We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of such information. This moment became a watershed in the history of American intelligence. On the one hand, the operation proved that the United States was capable of doing the technically impossible. On the other, it became a symbol of how far secrecy can go. Many analysts and historians later acknowledge that Azorian was a unique mission, both in terms of technology and in terms of moral dilemmas. It forever changed the approach to underwater operations, to the interaction of intelligence and government, to the way information is hidden and controlled. Meanwhile, the CIA did not lose interest in the rest of the K-1-9. After all, most of the submarine, including the forward compartment with warheads, remained on the bottom. The question of whether there would be a second attempt remained open. After the partial success of Operation Azorian in 1974 and the subsequent scandal associated with its leak to the press, it seemed that the story of the K-1-9 submarine was over. However, in the depths of the CIA, discussions continued about the possibility of conducting a second phase of the mission, an attempt to raise the remaining fragments of the submarine again. These plans were codenamed Project Matador. Unlike the first attempt, it was surrounded by an even tighter ring of secrecy. At the same time, many high-ranking officials in the American government, including senators and Pentagon representatives, did not even suspect the existence of these intentions. The initiators of the second stage were several influential figures in the US intelligence community who believed that valuable information still remained at the bottom, not only in the form of nuclear warheads, but also as a possible source of intelligence on the technical parameters of Soviet submarines, encryption methods, and even the psychology of the crew. One such supporter, the then Deputy Director of Scientific and Technical Affairs at the CIA, pointed out that we have already proven that we can do it. The question is whether we dare to do it again. However, unlike the first phase, Project Matador faced serious internal resistance. Some members of Congress, who had been given limited access to the materials, were categorically opposed to new expenditures. The financial scandal surrounding the Glomar Explorer had not yet died down, and a repeat mission could cause a storm in the press. In addition, the international situation had changed. In 1975, the Soviet Union and the United States signed the SALT II Strategic Arms Talks Agreement, and a new underwater operation could jeopardize these fragile agreements. Internal CIA documents from that time, later partially declassified, show that the organization seriously considered various scenarios, from freezing the project completely to carrying out the recovery by a private contractor, with complete denial of the US government's participation. At the same time, signs began to emerge that the Soviet Union had not abandoned hope of reaching the remains of the K-129. According to US Navy radio intercepts, Soviet research vessels and auxiliary ships of the Pacific Fleet were increasingly appearing in the area of the submarine's supposed location. The Americans suspected that the USSR had received a leak of information and was now trying to at least partially survey the bottom using deep-sea vehicles. This greatly increased the risks. If the Soviets found out that it was the US that raised part of the submarine, the consequences could be catastrophic, both in terms of diplomacy and given the threat of nuclear escalation. Meanwhile, the Glomar Explorer sat idle in a California harbor, becoming the subject of heated debate. Some suggested converting the vessel into a drilling platform, others writing it off and dismantling it for scrap metal in order to finally hide its true purpose. The CIA, however, insisted on preserving the ship and a potential tool for future operations. For several months, the ship was guarded. No one was allowed on board, and all documents related to its technical characteristics were reclassified. At the same time, a behind-the-scenes struggle for control over information unfolded. The CIA leadership realized that even if they refused to mount a new expedition, they needed to create a plausible legend. Thus, the idea of officially exposing the mission as a failed attempt to extract manganese nodules from the ocean floor was born. Photos of the ship, interviews with geological engineers, and even pseudo-scientific articles in magazines leaked to the press. All this was supposed to finally distract attention from the version about the submarine being raised. However, journalists continued to dig, and soon new details appeared on the pages of the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times confirming the connection between the Glomar and the CIA operation. Society was once again in an uproar. In response to the wave of accusations, the White House for the first time used a unique legal mechanism, a public refusal to provide information in the interests of national security. This step would later become part of the Glomar Doctrine in dozens of court cases. A precedent had been set. The state officially refused to acknowledge the very existence of the project, let alone its content. At this point, Operation Matador was effectively frozen. However, according to some reports, in 1976, technical specialists appeared on board the ship again, and preparatory work was carried out, allegedly under the guise of a technical inspection. One of the engineers, who later became an informant, claimed that a new capture module was being prepared on the ship, reinforced and adapted to the uneven relief of the bottom. The question of a repeat expedition remained open at least until 1978, when the Glomar Explorer was finally withdrawn from the CIA program. Meanwhile, the effects of the operation continued to be felt at the level of international relations. The Soviet Union increased the protection of its own underwater routes, introduced new encryption protocols, and began using unique self-destruct devices built into nuclear warheads. This was a direct response to suspicions of information leaks. In addition, the Soviet Navy intensified its activities in the Alaska region, and attempts to collect data on the movements of American submarines were recorded. The Cold War entered a new phase, even more secretive, even more technically intensive. The K-1-9 submarine itself remained on the seabed. Most of the hull, possibly with missiles and encryption equipment, was never raised, but its story was not over. In the mid-1980s, several independent researchers began publishing materials that cast doubt on the official versions of both sides. Theories arose that the K-1-9 had not simply sunk, but had been drawn into some secret conflict between internal forces of the USSR, allegedly linked to an attempt at rebellion or defection to the West. Others claimed that the cause of the sinking was an accidental or deliberate attack by an American submarine. None of the versions was officially confirmed, but the number of questions continued to grow. Why did the submarine deviate from its course? Why did the USS stop searching so quickly? Why did the US invest hundreds of millions of dollars in such a risky operation? And what did they actually raise from the seabed? In this silence and uncertainty, one of the greatest maritime mysteries of the 20th century was born. As time went on, more and more details of Operation Azorian began to leak into the public domain. Declassified documents, recollections of participants, leaks to the press, and independent investigations made it possible to reconstruct not only the course of events, but also the consequences of this mission for both the United States and the world. However, as interest grew, contradictions also emerged. Some sources claimed that the operation was purely a technical experiment, while others claimed that the raised section actually contained classified documents and equipment. Still others claimed that all of this was just a cover for a much more complex and large-scale mission that was still hidden from the public. One of the key mysteries remained the fate of the K-1-29's bow. It was in this section that the silos with ballistic missiles, navigation systems, coding units, and command devices were located. If the United States managed to at least partially study this segment, they could obtain invaluable information about the Soviet principles of launching nuclear weapons. Some analysts suggested that even fragments of circuit boards could have been used to create interference or intercept a signal. However, US officials either denied the fact that this part was on board or cited the impossibility of obtaining data due to the degree of destruction of the hull. This uncertainty gave rise to a whole wave of alternative versions. One of the most resonant appeared in the 1990s, when a former US Navy officer said in an interview that the real target of the operation was not the K-1-9 submarine at all, but a container installed on it several months before the crash. According to him, the container could have contained an experimental encryption system that the Soviet military was testing as part of a closed project. No one was able to confirm this information, but it gave rise to new theories. What if the US did not simply raise the remains of a submarine, but obtained technology ahead of its time? Meanwhile, interest in the operation was renewed against the backdrop of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Under the new conditions, archives that were previously classified as top secret became available. Russian historians began to raise documents from the Naval Archive, and some of them actually confirmed that the K-129 crew was sent on a highly classified mission. One of the reports indicated that the submarine command had no direct contact with the shore after entering the ocean, which was extremely unusual for such operations. This could indicate that a new autonomous control system or data transmission system was being tested. Against the backdrop of these discoveries, A campaign for the complete declassification of all materials related to the Azorian began in the United States. Activists, journalists, and researchers filed Freedom of Information Act requests, demanding that data stored in the CIA and Navy archives be opened. The answer was the standard refusal under the formula, "We can neither confirm nor deny," which went down in history as the Glomar Doctrine. However, the pressure continued to grow, and by the end of the 1990s, the first official materials were published, partially confirming the CIA's participation in the operation to raise the Soviet submarine. One of the most interesting documents is a report by the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, which stated that the operation was of strategic importance and yielded valuable intelligence data. However, the specifics remained outside the scope. Neither the technical parameters nor the contents of the recovered fragments were disclosed. This further fueled interest. Journalistic investigations, documentaries, interviews with former participants appeared, and although many of them tried to be careful in their wording, the general message was obvious. Operation Azorian was much more significant than previously thought. A hypothesis arose among researchers that the operation served not only as a means of collecting intelligence, but also as a kind of political signal. The United States, having information about the location of the submarine's demise and its contents, could use this data as a tool to pressure the Soviet Union. Even without revealing it openly, the presence of evidence that could be presented at the right time provided a strategic advantage in diplomatic negotiations and played a role in the formation of the so-called containment policy. In parallel, less public consequences were unfolding. In response to the Glomar Explorer leak and the scale of American underwater intelligence, the USS has stepped up the development of deep-sea monitoring systems. Design work began on new classes of submarines, equipped with autonomous tracking and detection systems. In addition, the Soviet military introduced a fundamentally new protocol for destroying classified data on board submarines, from self-destructing encryption blocks to forced demagnetization of hard drives. All of this was a direct consequence of the fear that a second Azorian could happen again. Interestingly, in America itself, this operation sparked a new wave of discussions about the ethics of intelligence operations. Many wondered, where is the line between national security and international provocation? Can a country that positions itself as a defender of freedom and nor secretly raise the remains of another state's military ships, even if they are at the bottom of the ocean? These questions still have no clear answer. And this, perhaps, is one of the main secrets of the entire operation. Another non-obvious consequence of Azorian was the transformation of the approach to intelligence itself. If previously agents, interceptions, and espionage were considered the basis, now technology has come to the fore. Deep-sea vehicles, robotic systems, satellite imaging, and cyber intelligence. All this received an impetus for development in the 1970s and 80s. After such operations, the CIA, realizing the possibilities of technical intelligence, invested billions in the creation of new platforms, many of which remain classified to this day. Azorian thus became only a symbol of engineering audacity, but also a turning point for the entire intelligence community. It was a case of spy games going beyond the usual boundaries, to the high seas, to the depths of the ocean, to the realms of science, technology, and moral dilemmas. Even decades later, the operation remains an object of study, fascination, and debate.